I have carried this for 51 years. The man who lived it carried it for 7 before he gave it to me, and I have held it ever since without telling a soul except Mabel. And Mabel is gone now, and I am 71 years old with a heart that the doctor describes in careful language, and I have decided I am not taking this to the ground with me. My uncle ran a trapline in the high country above Atlin, British Columbia, for 18 winters, and something out there left firewood at his cabin. Not once, not twice. 9 separate winters documented in his own hand, in a ledger I have kept in a fireproof box under my workbench for more than 3 decades. I want to say that plainly before I say anything else, because I know how it sounds, and I am not a man who has ever had much patience for stories that sound this way. But here we are. To understand why it matters, I need to go back to the beginning. Not my beginning, Earl's. My uncle, Earl Jennings, was born in 1921 in Whitehorse and grew up in a house where sentiment was considered a form of waste. His father trapped and logged and did whatever the country asked of him, and Earl absorbed that disposition the way a plank absorbs weather, quietly and completely, until it was just what he was made of. He was not a big man, but he had the kind of stillness that large men sometimes work their whole lives to achieve and never quite manage. When Earl decided something, he decided it. When he told you something was true, you did not require a second opinion. He married Mabel in 1946, 2 years after he came home from the Pacific. Mabel was from a farming family outside of Carcross, and she was, in her own way, exactly as immovable as he was. They were well matched in that specific respect. He did not talk much, and she did not require it, but when she had a position, she held it with both hands, and no amount of argument shifted her. I will come back to Mabel. She matters to how this ends. Earl started trapping in the high country above Atlin in the fall of 1948. He had looked at that country for 2 years before he committed to it, hiking the ridgelines in summer, reading the drainages, learning where the marten moved in early winter and where the beaver settled the secondary creeks. He was methodical in the way that men in hard country are methodical, not because anyone taught him a system, but because in that country a gap in your attention cost you. He filed the necessary paperwork with the provincial trapping office in Atlin, paid his registration, and set his line across roughly 60 miles of high-altitude terrain that very few other people wanted to bother with, because it was steep and the weather came fast, and the nearest reliable road was 32 miles from his main cabin, by trail. That cabin is where most of what I am going to tell you took place. He had built it himself in the summer of 1947, the year before he started the line, hauling materials up in stages with a pack string of 3 horses, taking 2 full seasons to get it sound. It was a single room, 14 feet by 18 feet, with a pole roof and a proper cast iron stove that he had carried up in pieces and assembled on site. He was proud of that stove. He mentioned it in his letters to my father in terms that other men might reserve for something living. The cabin sat at roughly 4,000 feet on the lee side of a ridge, sheltered enough from the worst of the northwest wind that it was livable even in January, when Atlin's temperatures dropped to the kind of cold that makes metal brittle, and your breath sounds like tearing paper. He ran the line solo. Every winter from 1948 through 1966, he went up in October after the first hard freeze, worked the high country until March, and came down in the mud. Mabel stayed in Atlin and kept the house, and kept track of every day he was gone on a calendar above the kitchen table with a pencil mark, and she told me once that she never once slept through the night in all those years, not fully, not without listening for something she couldn't name. I started going up to help him during the summers, checking the cabin, clearing trail, doing maintenance, from the time I was about 14 years old. That would have been around 1966, which turned out to be the last year Earl used the line, though I didn't know that then. I had 8 summers of working alongside him before his health declined, and I knew that country the way you know a place when you have sweated in it and been cold in it and sat quiet in it long enough that it starts to feel like an extension of your own thinking. That is my claim to this account. Not that I was there for what happened. I was not. But I knew the country. I knew the man. And when he gave me the ledger and told me what was in it, I was not a stranger receiving a rumour. I was the nearest thing to a witness that was left. I should say one more thing about Earl before I get into the ledger. He did not tell stories. I mean that as a specific description, not a general one. He was constitutionally opposed to anything that could not be supported by what he had seen with his own eyes or measured with his own hands. He had a saying, which I heard him use exactly twice in my life, and it went like this: "A man who decorates the truth is a man who has run out of truth to tell." He said it once about a neighbour and once about a politician, and both times he said it the same way, flat and final, like closing a gate. That is the man who wrote the ledger I am about to describe to you. The ledger itself is 4 inches wide and 6 inches tall, water-stained at the bottom left corner, the cover a dark green that has faded to something closer to grey. He used it to document his line, the way any working trapper would. Catch numbers, set locations, weather, condition of the trail, how much wood was left in the cache, any anomalies worth recording. It is not a diary. There are no feelings in it. What there is a record, kept in the same pencil hand for 18 winters. And starting in the entry for November 18th, 1952, there is something that does not fit the rest of the record. I want to read you his exact words from that entry, because they are more useful than anything I could say around them. He wrote, "Arrived at High Cabin 3 p.m. Good time from the lower cache. Found a quantity of split wood stacked against the east wall under the overhang. Approximate volume 4 feet by 4 feet by 16 inches deep. Wood is dry spruce, split clean. Did not cut this wood. Did not stack this wood. Trail shows no horse sign since first freeze. No boot tracks in the current snow. Will consider." That is the entire entry. 4 sentences of observation, and one that stops like a man who has run out of acceptable conclusions. He used the phrase, "will consider," the way another man might use a longer silence. It was his notation for a problem he could not yet solve. I have thought about that entry for 50 years. What strikes me is not the anomaly itself, as strange as it is, but the tone. He does not say he was unsettled. He does not say he was frightened. He records what is there and what is missing from the expected explanation. And then he says he will consider it. And the next entry is about a marten set on the North Fork that caught nothing and needed to be moved. He slept in that cabin that night, with 4 cord feet of wood he did not cut stacked against his east wall. And his next sentence is about a marten set. That is Earl. He worked through the winter of 1952 and into 1953, and the firewood did not come again that season. He burned what was there, all of it, and credited the cash volume in his ledger against what he calculated he owed in thanks to whoever had done it, which he had not yet decided was not a person. His first working explanation was that another trapper had used the cabin and left wood in exchange, which was an understood courtesy in that country. He checked with the trapping office in Atlin in the spring of 1953. No other trapper had a registered line within 12 miles of his high cabin. He noted this in the ledger under the date of his inquiry and wrote simply, "No registered user in range." The second explanation was that someone unregistered had passed through, a prospector or a hunter working the back country without a permit, which happened. He watched for sign the following winter and found none. No cut stumps within a reasonable distance of the cabin that he had not made himself. No marks on the trees that a working man would leave. The wood, the following November, which arrived sometime between his October setup run and his return in mid-November 1953, was split from timber he could not source to any stump he found on his subsequent survey of the area. He wrote in the ledger November 14th, 1953. Wood again. Same quality. Same placement under the east overhang. Larger stack this year, perhaps 6 feet by 4 feet by 18 inches. Cannot identify the timber source within practical range. Not a person I know of. Will consider. That phrase again, will consider. The third explanation, which he held onto for 2 more winters, was that he was miscalculating his own work. That he had cut wood during a previous trip and forgotten it. He tested this against his ledger entries, which were detailed enough to track every significant piece of physical work he did on the property, and he could not make the numbers fit. He had not cut that wood. He kept records precisely because the trapline was a business, and in a business you account for your labour. The wood was not his labour. By the winter of 1955, he had discarded all 3 explanations. He wrote on November 22nd of that year, after finding the 3rd stack and conducting what he described as a thorough survey of the surrounding terrain, out to a radius of roughly a mile from the cabin. Cannot account for the wood by any means available to me. Will stop trying to account for it and start trying to understand it. That sentence sits in the middle of a page surrounded by Martin tallies and weather observations, and it is the closest Earl ever came, in writing, to admitting that something outside his experience was operating on his property. He had a dog on the line with him for most of those years. Her name was Sable, a female sled dog, black with a tan chest. One of a litter he had bought from a man in Atlin who kept a small working team. Sable was not a dramatic animal. She did not bark at nothing, did not spook at wind or shadow the way some trail dogs do, and she had a steady way of watching the country around the cabin that Earl described to my father as like having a second set of eyes that you never had to argue with. He trusted her readings of the land the way he trusted his own instruments. In the winter of 1953, the first time the firewood came again, he noted that Sable had been calm throughout the previous night, sleeping at the foot of his bunk rather than lifting her head at any sound from outside. He mentioned this because he expected her to have reacted to whatever had come to the cabin. She had not. He wrote, Sable gave nothing. If she knew something was outside, she was comfortable with it. That detail returned in subsequent ledger entries. November 1954, November 1955, November 1957, each time with a slight variation in phrasing but the same substance. Whatever came to stack the wood, Sable was not alarmed by it. Earl registered this without making more of it than the observation warranted, but I know enough about working dogs to know what that means. A dog that has spent winters in that country knows the difference between weather and something with intention, and Sable knew something with intention was near the cabin and elected to stay at the foot of the bunk. The partial glimpse came in February of 1961. It is the entry I have read the most times. The paper at that page has softened slightly from handling, more than any other page in the ledger, and that is my doing. He was running a set on the upper drainage, about 2 miles northeast of the cabin, in the middle of a blizzard that had been building since the previous evening. He wrote that visibility was poor enough that he was navigating by his own trail markers and by his knowledge of the terrain rather than by sight. He had Sable with him. He was within 300 yards of the cabin on his return when Sable stopped and stood rigidly, not in alarm, he wrote, but in the attitude of a dog that has perceived something and is deciding what it means. She was looking at a stand of spruce about 40 yards to the left of the trail, at a place where the trees thinned slightly before the slope dropped away. He looked where she was looking. He wrote, "Saw a shape in the trees, partially obscured by snowfall, large, upright, not a bear. No bear of any size I've ever seen would account for the dimensions I observed. Watched for some time. Shape did not move in those seconds. I moved first. Did not stop to examine sign due to wind conditions destroying surface rapidly. Sable walked on without hesitation when I walked on." That is the full entry for February 9th, 1961. He did not elaborate in the margin. He did not follow up in subsequent entries with a return to the site, or at least not in writing. But the next entry, for February 11th, is notable for one thing. He recorded the usual details of his run, the catch, the weather, the state of the sets, and at the end of the entry, in a line that sits slightly separated from the rest, as though he added it after, he wrote, "Wood is always dry spruce, always split, always placed under the east overhang out of the weather." He was thinking about it. He just did not have language for what he was thinking, or he did not trust the language that was available. I have told this story twice. Once to my wife, not Mabel, my own wife Margaret, who passed in 2019, and she listened to the whole of it, and then sat quiet for a while, and then said, "Your uncle was an honest man." I agreed with her. Once to you. That is the count. The winter of 1964 is the heart of it. Earl was 62 years old that season, which is not old in years, but is old in the specific currency of solo traplines above 4,000 feet. He had been having trouble with his right knee through the fall of 1963, a problem that had started with a bad step on a wet rock during his summer maintenance trip, and had not resolved the way he had expected it to. He went up in October of 1963 anyway, because he had 18 years of momentum and a line that needed running, and the kind of stubbornness that does not negotiate with a knee. Mabel told him not to go. He went. January 14th, 1964 was a Monday. I know the date because the ledger entry is one of the few in the whole record that is written in a noticeably different hand, shakier than usual. The letters formed with more care than he normally used, the way a man writes when he is in pain and trying to maintain precision anyway. The recorded temperature for that morning was -31 degrees Fahrenheit. He had written the temperature at the top of each entry for 18 years, a habit left over from his father's practice. And -31 degrees is a temperature that means you do not spend more time outside than the work demands. He had gone out to check the nearest run of sets, a loop of about 4 miles that he could cover and return from in a few hours under good conditions. The knee gave out on the return leg. Not gradually. He wrote that it went all at once, like something releasing on a downslope section of trail about 1.5 miles from the cabin. He went down, and he could not put weight on the leg. He could move, he could crawl if he had to, but he could not walk, and at -31 degrees, 1.5 miles might as well be 10. He had Sable with him. He wrote that she stood close while he assessed the situation, which he did with what I recognize as Earl's particular brand of methodical calm, in circumstances that would have been producing panic in most men. He recorded the temperature. He noted the time, approximately 11 in the morning. He noted the distance to the cabin. He noted his equipment, which included his pack with emergency kit, matches, a small quantity of food, and a sleeping bag rated to 20 below. He was below the rating of his bag and an hour's crawl from shelter at minimum, with a leg that he described as not serviceable. He tried to move. He made progress, slow and painful, and Sable stayed alongside him, which is what a good trail dog does when her person is in trouble. He had covered perhaps 200 yards when he stopped to rest, and that is when Sable shifted. He wrote, "Sable left my side, moved perhaps 10 feet back along the trail, sat, watching the trees at the south edge, not frightened, the way she watches a person she knows is coming. He lay in the snow and watched her. He waited. He was, he wrote, too cold and too tired to feel much beyond the cold and the tiredness. But he was watching Sable because Sable had been reliable for 16 years, and he had no reason to stop trusting her now. Something came out of the trees. He did not describe it in dramatic terms. He described it the way he described everything, in the flattest language that could carry the facts. He wrote, large, upright, moving on 2 legs without difficulty in the snow, came to within 30 feet and stopped, looked at me, I looked at it. I could not say how long this lasted. I was aware of the size of it compared to the trees around it. I was aware that it was not a person and not anything else I had a name for. Sable did not move from her position and made no sound. Then he wrote, it came closer. It did not rush. It did not make noise. When it was close enough, I could see the breath coming off it in the cold and the colour of the hair, which was dark brown and not the black it had appeared from distance. The eyes were clear. I want to be precise about this. It looked at me the way something looks at you when it is deciding what to do, and what it decided was careful. What it did next is why I am telling this. It picked him up. He wrote that it lifted him with a steadiness that he associated with something practiced rather than effortful, the way a skilled man lifts a load he has lifted before and knows the balance of. He was not a small man, 200 pounds in his winter gear, and it moved with him without apparent strain. He wrote that he did not resist, and that he was not certain he could have resisted if he had wanted to, which he did not, because he was cold and he could not walk, and the cabin was 1.5 miles away. It carried him to the cabin. He estimated the time at something under 30 minutes, though he admitted his sense of time was compromised by the cold and the pain. He was set down on the porch step with what he described as a considered gentleness, which is not a phrase Earl used lightly. He got himself inside. He wrote that Sable was already at the door, and he could not account for when she had passed them, whether she had run ahead or whether she had simply been there when he arrived. He built up the stove. He got warm. He wrote the ledger entry. And then, at the bottom of the page, in a space below where a man normally stops writing, he added one more line. He wrote, "The wood it used to get me up the porch steps was from the east overhang stack. I counted the pieces moved. 7. He was telling me something even then. He knew that someday someone was going to read that ledger, and he wanted them to know that he had noticed, that the 7 pieces of wood that had been moved to give him purchase on the icy porch step had come from the same stack that had been appearing every November for 9 winters. He wanted that connection in the record. I have read that line more times than I can count, and I still cannot fully hold what it means. That it moved the wood deliberately. That it used what was available. That it understood what the porch step needed and supplied it. I do not know how to explain what that is. I have a word for it that Earl would not have used because the word is kindness, and Earl did not reach for words like that easily. The record reaches for them for him. He finished the season. He came down in March of 1964 and told Mabel he had hurt his knee on the line. She pressed him for the rest of it because Mabel had an instinct for incomplete accounts that was close to preternatural. And after a day and a half of that particular pressure, she got the main shape of the story out of him. She never doubted a word of it. That was Mabel's particular quality. She had no patience for official explanations of things she had already decided were true. The doctor in Atlin looked at the knee and said it was a torn ligament, partially healed wrong, and that he had no business being on a trapline in January with a knee in that condition, which Earl acknowledged without responding to. The doctor also said the knee would likely give him trouble the rest of his life, which proved accurate. Earl went up again in October of 1964, and again in October of 1965. He did not go up again after 1966. He never said directly that his decision to leave the line was connected to January of 1964, but I spent enough time with him in the years after to understand that a man who had spent 18 winters in that country did not simply stop because his knee was inconvenient. He stopped because something had changed in the accounting between himself and that high country, and he could not stay on the line and also honor what the accounting required. I am reading into the decision. I want to be honest about that, but I knew Earl, and I knew when a man was carrying a weight he was not going to explain, and he carried it from 1966 until the February morning in 1971, when he called me to the side of the bed. He was 69. It was a short winter, cold and clear, and he had been declining since November. I drove up from Whitehorse on the morning he asked for me, and Mabel met me at the door of the house in Atlin and said, "He's ready to say the rest of it." Not hello, just that. He gave me the ledger. He told me what the main entries contained, though I had already seen parts of it over the years when I was working the line with him in summer, and he would sometimes consult it for practical information. He told me the January 1964 account in full, sitting up in the bed with the ledger on the blanket between us, and he told it the way he had written it, without decoration, without anything that was not what he had seen. He was not performing the account. He was transferring it, the way you transfer a load you have been carrying too long to someone whose job it now is to carry it. Then he said, "There is one thing I want from you." I said I was listening. He said, "Don't give anyone the location of the high cabin. Not the coordinates, not the drainage, not a description that would put anyone on the trail there. Just leave it alone." I asked him why. He said, "Because whatever is up there, the last thing it needs is a crowd of people deciding they know better than it does about its own country." He said it without heat, just as a fact. Then he said, "Mabel knows the story. She's always known it. She never needed convincing, and I'm grateful for that. I'm asking you to carry the account after us and to keep the location out of it." I told him I would. He died 6 weeks later. Mabel kept the house in Atlin another 9 years, and then she came south to live near my family. And she and I talked about the account once in all that time, a single afternoon at her kitchen table with the ledger between us. And she said, "I always told him it didn't matter whether anyone believed him. What mattered was that it was true." Then she poured us both more coffee and we talked about something else. She passed in 1989, still certain, still immovable, never having doubted a word of what Earl had told her in that day and a half of unwilling disclosure in March of 1964. She was right, and I want to say that plainly here because it is one of the things I've been waiting to say. Mabel was right, and she was always right, and she went to her grave having held a truth that the world had no use for. And she held it with a composure that I have tried to match ever since without fully managing it. The obligation Earl passed to me was a small one. Don't name the place. I have honored it for 51 years, and I intend to honor it until I cannot any longer. The ledger I keep, but the location stays with me. If you are listening to this, and you are the kind of person who is already calculating which drainage above Atlin might match the description, I would ask you to reconsider. Not because I have told you enough to find it, because I have been careful not to, but because the instinct to go looking is exactly the instinct Earl was asking me to discourage. Some places earn the right to stay unmeasured. Some presences earn the right to stay unnamed. What I have been trying to understand in the 51 years since that bedside morning is why it did what it did. Why it came every November with firewood. Why it came out of the trees on a January morning at minus 31 degrees and carried a man it owed nothing to across a mile and a half of hard country and set him down on his own porch step. I have no answer that satisfies me completely. I have a guess, which is that the 18 years of Earl's careful presence in that country, his methodical non-intrusion, his specific kind of attention to the land that was not predatory, but was thorough and respectful in the way of a man who understands that a thing can be used and also honoured, that 18 years of that built something, a recognition, a record on both sides. That is my guess. I want to be clear, it is only a guess. I am not qualified to explain what that country contains, and I would be suspicious of anyone who was. What I know from the ledger and from the man who wrote it is that on 9 separate November arrivals, split spruce wood was stacked dry and sheltered against the east wall of a cabin 32 miles from Atlin in high country that registered at the Trapline office as unaccountably resourced. And on a Monday morning in January of 1964, when the temperature was 31 below zero, and a man was lying in the snow a mile and a half from the only shelter available to him, something came out of the trees and carried him home. I'm 71 years old. The doctor uses words I have started looking up. I have Margaret gone these 5 years and Earl gone 50, and the ledger is under my workbench in a fireproof box, and I have not told this account to anyone with enough of my life left ahead of me to do anything careless with it. That is the honest reason I am telling it now. The time for caution is finishing. Earl's high cabin stood for decades after he left the line. I checked on it during my summer maintenance trips through the late 60s and early 70s, after he stopped going up. The east overhang was there, the cast-iron stove was there, and for as long as I made those trips, which was until 1974, when the trail washed out badly enough that the cost of clearing it exceeded my means, the wood was there. Not always the same quantity, not always the same year, but present, stacked dry under the overhang the way it always had been. I have not been back since 1974. I am not able to go back now. Whatever is up there is on its own account now and has been for a long time, and I think it was always on its own account, and the only thing Earl and I and Mabel and now you have to do with it is carry the knowledge carefully and not make it into something it needs to defend against. The last entry in the ledger is from March 12th, 1966. Earl's final day on the line before he came down for good. He recorded the standard information, weather and catch and state of the trail, and at the bottom of the entry, in the space he always reserved for anything that did not fit neatly into the other categories, he wrote 4 words. He wrote, "East overhang, good stock." He left enough wood in the cache to last the winter. Whether for the cabin or for whatever used the cabin as a waypoint in its own movements through that high country, I cannot tell you. Maybe Earl could not tell you either. Maybe the distinctions stopped mattering to him by then. I think about Sable sometimes. The way she is recorded in those ledger entries, calm and present, not a hair raised at a presence that by any reasonable accounting should have sent a working dog into alarm. She trusted what she sensed there. She had 16 winters of data to work from, and she arrived at a conclusion that she held consistently for the rest of her years on the line. I have always thought there was something worth considering in that. A dog does not manage her reactions. She responds to what is there. And what Sable responded to in the trees around that high cabin in the country above Atlin for all those years was something she had no reason to fear. Earl was not a man who would say he was grateful to something he could not explain. He would have said that was sentimental. But he left wood in that cabin when he left the line for good, and he spent 6 weeks on his deathbed deciding that the only person he trusted with the ledger was someone who knew the country and would treat the account the way the account deserved to be treated. That is as close to gratitude as Earl got, and it is close enough. I have kept faith with what he asked of me. I am keeping faith with it now, telling you the account without telling you the place. The location stays where it has always been, in the family of the account, which is small and is now, I suppose, just you and me. I don't know what it was. I have 51 years of considering the question, and I have not arrived at language that feels adequate, and I have stopped expecting to. What I know is that a man I trusted completely, a man constitutionally opposed to any statement he could not support, wrote down 9 winters of firewood and a January morning, and a mile and a half, carried through -31 degrees. And every word he wrote rings true against everything I know about him, and that country and the particular way the hard places of this world sometimes produce, against all reasonable expectation, something that chooses to be careful with us. If you ever find yourself in country that old and that quiet, the country where the spruce grows in tight against the ridgeline and the wind comes through in a way that has nothing to do with you, stand still for a moment. Just stand still. Earl would not have said the country is watching, because he did not talk that way. He would have said the country knows more than you do, and the decent response to that is patience. I think he was right about that. I think he was right about a lot of things I was too young to hear properly the first time. The ledger is under my workbench. When I am gone, I expect my daughter will find it and wonder at it, and I have written her a letter that gives her enough to understand what she is holding. I have not told her the location. The location goes with me, the way Earl intended, and I am at peace with that. Sable is in every entry from 1952 to 1966. Every single entry that mentions anything out of the ordinary, she is there, calm at the foot of the bunk, or steady beside him on the trail, or sitting 10 feet back on the snow, watching the trees at the south edge, waiting for something she already knew the shape of to come out of the timber and do what it had come to do. I have thought about that more than I can tell you. A dog at the foot of a bunk in a cabin 32 miles from the nearest road, in country that would kill you without hesitation if you gave it the chance, not lifting her head at the thing that came every November to leave wood under the east overhang. Comfortable with it. That word was Earl's. I'm comfortable with it too now. It took me most of my life to get there, but I'm comfortable with it. If this account stays with you, there is one more story on the screen, from another man who carried something out of the deep country for longer than was good for him, and finally put it down. You might want to sit with this one for a moment first. No hurry.